Welcome back to World War II TV. Mark Wilson teaches history at the University of North Carolina and is the author of Destructive Creation, American Business and the Winning of World War II. And he is here as part of our Economies and Industries series, which has spread out over a few weeks. And I'll bring him in now. If you're new to the channel, we've had a few new subscribers recently. Welcome aboard. All the information you need is always in the description below. You'll find links to my guests' websites and their books. So Mark's book is linked in the description below. You'll find links to our merchandise, etc., etc. Without further ado, I'll bring Mark in. Good afternoon, Mark. How are you today?
Hi, Paul. Thanks so much for having me.
And I always ask people who are making their first appearance, how you define yourself, because obviously you teach history, but that's a massive subject. So, obviously you've written about factories and industry, but when you're asked, like at a dinner party, to define how you talk about history, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, so over the last 20 years or so, I've been mostly working in the field of the history of U.S. military-industrial relations. And a lot of that, leads me to be in the circles of business historians and to some extent military historians as well. I started off by working on the Civil War period. So my first book was about how the North mobilized its economy to fight the Civil War. And the leading characters in that book were Army quartermasters.
Right.
And then the book that we're talking about today is my second major book, which is about the U.S. industrial mobilization for World War II.
And as we always talk about in this channel, I mean, it sort of comes under the heading of logistics, really, because at the pointy end of every army are the tanks and the bayonets and the rifles. But behind all that is the ability to produce that, and that's obviously what we've been talking about recently. So, folks, Mark has come armed with a PowerPoint that I'll load up now. He's in charge of it today, and folks, we'll do kind of questions as we go along. But if they're kind of big, broad ones, we might save some of them for the end. But basically, I'm going to hand over to Mark to take us through this fascinating subject. So over to you, Mark.
Well, thanks again, Paul. And as you said, we'll be happy to take questions along the way and or at the end, and I look forward to engaging with the audience. So I decided to start our discussion today with a little bit of a prelude. And this is the first time I've done this talking about this book, but I think it's worth a try. And so my prelude is about one single company that was a kind of major producer on the U.S. home front in World War II. And I know this slide is a little bit detailed, and I don't know how well the viewers can see it, but this is an image from a massive list of printed war contracts that the U.S. government kept during World War II. This is one of the many sources I used for my book. And what I've tried to show here is just the listings of some contracts from a single company called Jack and Heinz Incorporated. And viewers might be able to see that it was located in Bedford, Ohio, in the Cleveland, Ohio area in northern Ohio. And when I did my research, I actually had a chance to go out to the Cleveland area. I even went to the Bedford County Historical Society, as I recall, and I looked at some stuff that they had there on this company. If the viewers can see the slide in sharp focus, they might be able to tell that Jack and Heinz was a major supplier of starters. In other words, the machines that were used to actually start the engines of aircraft. And this company was a so-called war baby. It was created in 1940 when the war was already started. And one of the partners in the company, Ralph Heinz, had invented a new improved starter that could be used in aircraft. It was a good time to start this company. And they sold huge numbers of these starters and quickly amassed tens of millions of dollars worth of contracts. And I promised the viewers I'm not going to talk about this company the whole hour, but bear with me for a minute. Here I've got a couple photos. On the left, you can see a young woman who's working assembling some of the products that Jack and Heinz made during the war. They also made autopilots, which used gyroscopes that were designed and built by the Sperry Gyroscope Company in New York, but they were a kind of a second source producer making these things under license for the armed forces. On the image on the right, you can see that they won an Army Navy E award, and some of your viewers may be familiar with that, an E for excellence. Some of the war plants in the US were given this distinction by the US military for outstanding production achievements. Actually, Bill, Jack, and Ralph Hines are among the people holding that banner in that image there. They ended up having over $400 million worth of prime contracts for World War II, mostly for these starters and automatic pilots. And they ended up expanding their operations into multiple plants in the Cleveland area. About $15 million worth of new plant was built by and for Jack and Heinz, and about half of that was provided by the U.S. government. And what I'm trying to suggest in this prelude is some of the elements of the story of Jack and Heinz were kind of typical and important in terms of what was going on with the U.S. industrial mobilization for World War II. In fact, it was quite common for the government to supply the buildings and machinery that were used by many private companies in World War II, like Jack and Heinz, to produce the stuff that went into the war effort. And here I'm talking about not just small parts like starters, but the very biggest weapons in use in the war, including tanks, bombers, and ships. So what I would like to suggest before we end this prelude is that there's some kind of interesting puzzles or questions that we might ask if we're thinking about a company like Jack and Heinz and its massive wartime expansion in World War II. And I think some of these questions or puzzles actually threaten or violate some of the received wisdom that we might know about the record of the U.S. Industrial mobilization. For one thing, I think the story of Jack and Heinz, raises questions about the extent to which big business, the big companies like GM or DuPont or Ford, et cetera, dominated contracting in World War II. Some of your viewers who are interested in the subject might know that actually many historians and even many journalists and observers and politicians in the 1940s complained a lot that war contracting in the US was dominated by the big industrial corporations. If that's the case, how do you explain the story of Jack and Heinz? That got over $400 million in prime contracts in World War II. It wasn't just a subcontractor, but it was dealing directly with the government. I think that the story of this company also raises questions about how we should understand the contributions of the companies, like Jack and Heinz on the one hand, and public entities, public authorities, like Army and Navy officers, like civilian mobilizers in agencies like the War Production Board. To what extent should we see the U.S. industrial mobilization as a miraculous creation of the private sector? Or to what extent should we understand that there was a big role being played by public authorities, including the armed forces and civilian mobilizers? That's an interesting question. And as some of your viewers might know, historians, conservative kind of pro-business historians, have worked very hard to emphasize the story of a miracle of war production created by for-profit companies. In the talk today, I'd like to kind of question some of that and maybe threaten some of that conventional wisdom. And then finally, just briefly, because Jack and Heinz actually was a important part of this story, I'll suggest that there was also a problem on the U.S. home front with the industrial mobilization in terms of the intermeshing of capitalism on the one hand, which after all was at the heart of the U.S. economy, and the war effort, where the pursuit of profit and the maximization of profit was not necessarily desired or liked by much of the public during the war, as millions of young men were sent off to the war, paid a minimal salary, and risking life and limb. And in fact, Jack and Heinz turned out to be directly involved in the congressional response to this problem, or one of the responses to this problem, because after Jack and Heinz paid millions of dollars in bonuses to its employees in 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, Congress held hearings that investigated this company and others, and decided in the springtime of 1942 to require companies to give back a bunch of their profits that were designed as excessive. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the future, but this was so-called statutory renegotiation.
Mm.
And the US continued to use this actually into much of the Cold War as well. But it speaks to the problem, I think, of mixing capitalism on the one hand and an all-out war effort on the other.
And I think just to jump in, Mark,
Yeah.
that's I think one of the most commonly held notions. I mean, as a tour guide when I was doing the touring in the mag, is that Americans will often say when they're over in Normandy how, oh, of course, the US was thoroughly behind the war effort. They were behind Churchill, they were behind this, and everyone was of a single mind back in 1940-41. I go, no, they weren't. The US was divided about whether they should even participate in World War II. So I think the thing that I'm looking forward to hearing you talk about is I think we have this concept 80 years on that whatever's happening in any of the allied countries, it's everybody is behind it. It's universal. Everybody is on board with it, and everybody's of a single-minded, one-track focus to win the war. And I think the complexity of it is that it isn't. I mean, in Britain, the cliche is that you could leave your door open in World War II because there was no crime. But in fact, in the Blitz, crime rocketed because criminals saw the blackout as an opportunity. So we're dealt with we live with these myths that we built up with, that there's this single-minded focus. And from what I understand, that was never quite as simple as that with the subject you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I try to do in my book is talk a lot about the conflict and the tensions on the home front, between government, especially between business and government authorities, but also between workers and managers and so forth. So, yeah, I think we'll have fun talking about that in the minutes to come.
So just to start off with one of the questions, because they are flying in. So
Yeah.
I'll bring up various ones in there. But I think the one that I think I want to deal with first is from Peter O'Connell, saying he realized that the US had taken steps to rearm before hostilities began, but how long did the US take to convert the rest of its pre-war economy to a total war footing? So I guess that's kind of a big subject there, and I'm assuming that you're going to be breaking some of that down in the talk. But we were talking with submarines yesterday with James Scott, and he was saying how the American submarine program was well on its way all through the 1930s. So how alert was the US in the 1930s to the fact that there was going to be a war happening, and whether or not the US participated, there was going to need be a new plan to deal with it in terms of the economy and production?
Yeah, I think, that's a great, thanks to Peter for the great question. And I think it's appropriate for me to jump kind of into my next couple slides, because this is going to be exactly what I'm talking about in the next couple minutes. So I promise to answer the question just in the next few minutes. So just as I'm actually going to organize the conversation around the structure of my book. The book has 6 chapters. The first chapter is actually about the World War I, 1920s, and early 1930s period. I'm not going to talk much about that right now. But as you can imagine, and as was the case with other nations, the World War I experience was quite formative for Americans. And they came out of that experience, for one thing, to speak to your question, they did actually plan for a future industrial mobilization. And there were institutions created in the 1920s, like the Army Industrial College, for example, that were charged with the task of actually planning for the next big industrial mobilization, and they worked in the 20s and 30s to continue contact with industry and place educational orders with industry and so forth. So I deal with a little bit of that in the first chapter, but I'm going to jump into my discussion of my second chapter, in which I'll speak to Peter's question, which is, what was the kind of chronology of all this, and how long did it take for the U.S. to ramp up? So I kind of, the way I organize the story in this chapter is that I talk about a late 1930s story of rearmament, and this rearmament was driven largely by actually French and British orders, but it was also pushed internally by congressional appropriations. And as for the submarines and other warships, as you and your viewers know, Roosevelt was quite a naval enthusiast, and even from the beginning of the New Deal, he was pushing for funding to go to warship construction. And not only by the late 30s, but even in the mid 30s, the US Navy was starting to build a bunch of new warships. And that's why the US had success in the very earliest days of the war against Japan in battles in the Pacific. They had already built all of these warships in the 30s and the warships take years to build. If they hadn't done that, they wouldn't have had that success in the Pacific so early. The aircraft industry was really given a huge boost in the late 30s by French and British orders. I have an image here of Pratt and Whitney, the premier manufacturer of aircraft engines in the United States. They actually created a big new wing, a British wing, a French wing in the late 30s using French and British money. So a lot of what was happening in these key industries, especially shipbuilding and aircraft and aircraft engine production, was subsidized by the French and the British, and then also increasingly by the US Congress. So as of early 1940, those industries had been stimulated, but the US was not even close to mobilizing for a major war. That really changed a lot with the fall of France in 1940. That got the attention of Congress, and Congress started to just throw huge sums of money at the mobilization effort. And so here I'm talking about the year and a half before Pearl Harbor. In the year and a half before Pearl Harbor, there were actually tremendous strides were made in the US in terms of mobilizing for a massive war effort. And in the book, I emphasize the importance of GoCo facilities, government-owned, contractor-operated. This was really at the core of the U.S. industrial mobilization for World War II. In other words, the private sector didn't pay for the new plant, but the government did. The private sector did manage and operate the new plant using their expertise and manage the workers inside these facilities. And huge numbers of these facilities were built during the war, but a lot of them got started after the fall of France and before Pearl Harbor, including massive explosives facilities that were run by DuPont, bomber plants run by the major aircraft companies like Boeing, Lockheed, Douglas, and so forth, right? The tank arsenal, which was an Army-owned facility run by Chrysler outside of Detroit, and so on and so on and so on. And so much of this, I should add what the shipyards, the merchant shipyards run by Kaiser and other companies were built in a similar fashion. So what the U.S. is doing in that year and a half before Pearl Harbor is they're building dozens of massive new plants that are absolutely critical to its ability to assist the Allies and then also become a major force in the war. So I spent a good deal of time in that chapter talking about that effort. And then so one of the consequences of this pattern is that the US owns huge amounts of the military industrial capacity in the country by the end of, well, by the middle of the war, right? And so here in this chart, I've suggested that the US, not only does it create a huge new atomic weapons program and synthetic rubber industry that didn't even exist at all before the war, but the US also owns close to 90%, the government owns, right, 90% of the industrial capacity in the aircraft and shipbuilding industries. They also own over half of the light metals sector, even though there's a giant private company, Alcoa, and also Dow, that have their own facilities. So this is a largely government-owned industrial base that the U.S. uses in World War II. I think that's not necessarily widely understood, and has important political and economic implications that some of your viewers might be interested in. And then finally, after Pearl Harbor, of course, the U.S. was turning in the direction of a more all-out mobilization. And as your viewers know, maybe 40% of GDP eventually is going to the war effort. And at this point, so by the beginning of 1942, pretty much all of American manufacturing is roped in.
Right.
And now, the situation actually becomes a lot more diverse and complex, because now there's they continue to build a lot of government-owned plants, but they also start to try to adapt or convert existing private plant for military purposes. And so a lot of the military trucks or Jeeps might be made in existing plants of companies like Ford or GM. And, there are a lot of famous conversion stories that your viewers are probably familiar with. The clock makers might make bomb fuses, and, jukebox makers start making machine guns, and so forth. So that does happen. So there is important and interesting conversion work going on, but I think we can kind of overstate the importance of that. In fact, so much of the production is occurring in brand new plant that's owned by the government.
Okay, just another quick question for you, because we've moved on to 42. I want to go take you back to 1940, because when Michael Nyberg has been on the channel, he talks about the fall of France as being incredibly influential in terms of American political decisions. Do you see that in your research in the factories, that the fall of France and the repercussions of that have a direct, I mean, you mentioned it kind of in passing, but does it have a huge effect on where factories and production is going?
I think so. I think it really just opens the floodgates of funding. It's like night and day before and after May, June of 1940. It's like night and day in terms of the mobilization. And as I said, a lot of these government-owned massive new war plants are put up just right after the fall of France. So I'd say yes, absolutely critical event economically, and as well as politically.
And the other one, and I'm sure you're going to be addressing this, but it's several people have kind of articulated it in various ways, and it's about the compromise between providing workers in all these new factories and providing people for an army. And when we had Dennis Havlat on last week, he was talking about the fact that the Germany goes to something like 17% of its men involved in in the armed forces, which is way more than it should be having, and therefore that's why its economy and its production is crashing. So America is trying to create bomber pilots and navigators and infantry and paratroopers but it's also trying to fill up these factories. How was the need to balance where you put people managed in the kind of the early war years?
Yeah, that's a really important subject. I don't focus a huge amount in the book on manpower, but of course the US was deeply concerned about this. There was a War Manpower Commission. Some of your viewers might be familiar with that. And there were huge efforts to manage this problem. To some extent, it was also a regional problem, because some of the decisions about where to put plants were made keeping in mind where were there labor surpluses or labor shortages. And so if certain regions had high unemployment rates or low unemployment rates, that actually figured in to some of the thinking of the people putting up the plants. I mean, the question of, how many people can you afford to put in the armed forces versus leave behind is a huge one. The U.S. also, this might be an opportunity to mention an interesting dilemma that came up in 1942. The U.S. also grappled with the so-called feasibility dispute in 1942, where the armed forces were trying to grab even more resources or even a bigger chunk of GDP out of the economy. And some economists associated with the mobilization started to push back and say, wait a minute, if you start to try to schedule 60% of GDP for the military effort, the civilians are really going to be suffering on the home front. And so they actually pulled back in the fall of 42 in this feasibility dispute resolution, and the armed forces had to settle for a bit less than they wanted. And as your viewers know, civilians on the U.S. home front actually, in part because of that decision, were easily the most comfortable and well-fed civilians in the world during that period.
I mean, that's the point Dennis Havlett made last week, is that 10% he proposed as an economist was the critical figure. If more than 10% of the population is involved in the military, in actually serving in the military, the economy will suffer. And he said the USA never got beyond 8.9, so it always kept under that. Britain was hovering around 10. I think Japan was hovering around 10 or 11. Soviet Union got to about 11, but Germany was 17. They're the figures I remember from Dennis's show. So what you're saying ties in with what he's saying, is that your government are thinking about this. They're realizing that too many people going into the military will have a negative effect on industry. So it's that it's interesting and important that your thoughts and his thoughts are kind of tying up there. It makes sense. But we'll push on from we'll leave it for questions a bit longer. We'll let you get a bit further into the presentation. But basically, we're loving it, so it's fantastic.
All right, that makes sense. Thanks. That's a really great question, and thanks for putting it in that way. I'm just going to show one more slide, which has to do with this my kind of big chapter on the overview of the mobilization, which is, if you're thinking about, well, what is going on, and here we could go back to Jack and Heinz as well, that Cleveland company that I started with. If you're thinking about what's going on in the organization of the U.S. industrial mobilization, you might ask the question, well, kind of who's in charge? Who should we see as the leading managers of this industrial mobilization? And I think many historians and many of your viewers might often answer that question by saying, well, it's really the titans of industry. In other words, it's the corporate executives who are the lead players. And we know a lot about the War Production Board, which was led by executives from big companies like Sears Roebuck and General Electric and General Motors and so forth. And so in Washington, those corporate executives were very influential, and they were also, of course, influential in their own companies out in the field. But what I'd like to add to the discussion a little bit, and I think your viewers might be sympathetic with this, is that the armed forces also had leaders who were big, important industrial managers. I'll add to that the U.S. Maritime Commission, where the former Navy admirals were in the leadership. And so in the Army Air Forces, in the Army Ordnance districts, in the Navy, right, and so on, there were a lot of people working on acquisition, on supply chain management, if you will, on kind of allocation of resources, along with the civilians. And I think we should, and there were just as many or more people in the armed forces working on those problems as there were in civilian agencies like the War Production Board, which I think are better known.
Mm.
And I think, so what I'd suggest is that, yes, the corporate leaders are important, but there are a lot of Army and Navy officers who are big players in this kind of task of mobilizing industry. Okay. One of the things, so my book is partly a kind of history of politics, if you will, on the struggles over power on the home front. And one of the things I do in the book is talk about a struggle to control the story or the messaging about what's going on the home front. And what I found in my research is that the business community, so business leaders, business associations, they're very eager and intent to seize control of the narrative, if you will. So what the business leaders want is for them to be understood as the winners of the war, if you will, because they're the ones who are generating this massive production of weapons that's going to allow the Allies to win the war, right? And that, it makes sense to a certain extent. And many of these leaders, here I have a quotation from J. Howard Pugh, who's a Sun Oil Company president, who was a kind of Koch brother of the day, if readers are familiar with the Koch brothers in our day, kind of a very pro-business, conservative business leader. And he was very eager to have a public relations effort to demonstrate that the private sector and that for-profit companies were winning the war. And so the business associations and individual companies mounted, pretty substantial public relations efforts during the war to associate their efforts with the winning war effort, right? And as we know, it did succeed, right? The U.S. industrial mobilization did provide huge fractions of the munitions used by the Allies, and the Allies did prevail, right? So in some ways, this story was true and made a lot of sense. And even kind of middle of the road business leaders that were on better terms with New Dealers really broadcast this message. And they basically tried to say it was the private companies, the for-profit companies, that did all the work. And the government, it kind of got in the way, as you can imagine. And labor unions also were unhelpful. So this was the kind of message being broadcast by the business community throughout the war. They said that capitalism won the war despite the interference of government and despite the hassles of labor. I showed you a slide with Jack and Heinz earlier at the beginning of the show, and with their Army Navy E banner. And I think the Army Navy E banner story, these awards that were given by the Army and the Navy for production excellence, they were actually providing a bit of a counter narrative or alternative story to the business story. Because at these big ceremonies where the Army or the Navy would come and give people prizes for excellence, they really went out of their way to feature a combination of workers, including union leaders in some cases, military officers, and also business leaders. So really all three of those parties were well represented and well celebrated at these Army Navy E awards. And so to some extent, the Pentagon or the military establishment was offering a bit of a counter narrative to the one that was being offered by the business leaders. And of course, labor unions had their own counter narrative as well, in which they emphasized the importance of workers and their contributions. But I think what I came away from the research concluding is that to a large extent, and maybe more than you might expect, it was the business story that was prevailing. In other words, the business community's effort to claim credit for the miracle of war production succeeded to a large extent. President Roosevelt didn't counter it very strongly. And in fact, by the end, even New Dealers more or less accepted it, in some cases rebroadcast it. And so Harold Ickes, who is one of the great, most influential of the New Dealers, who served in various capacities in Roosevelt's cabinet, as well as Harry Truman, a pro-New Deal congressman who's going to become vice president and then president after his service on the Truman Committee. Both of them, even though they're kind of middle of the road New Dealers and not necessarily conservative business people, they largely kind of parrot the business line in many ways during the war. And they say that, yeah, well, business really did the job and government needs to kind of get out of the way. And for New Dealers, this is kind of a remarkable kind of conversion, I think, to the pro-business story during the war. Anyway, so that's part of the book. Some of your viewers may be less interested in that, but I think it's an important part of the story is, this struggle to define how we should understand what happened. And that might have long-term implications that we could talk about later.
And just while Truman's on the slide there, Scott Grimmett is saying, can you ask about the Truman Commission's effect on U.S. military production? So you kind of half covered Truman's involvement there. Is there anything you want to say to that question?
Sure. I talk about the Truman Commission committee in the book, and for viewers less familiar, this is one of the bigger congressional investigations in U.S. history. They hold, many, many hearings, and they take many research trips to visit plants, especially in cases of alleged fraud or mismanagement. And they're kind of one of the great congressional watchdog groups in American history. To what extent did they affect production? I think probably, in a minimal way. But they did have business looking over their shoulder, to some extent, in terms of knowing that, any kind of alleged fraud or mismanagement might get them hauled before Congress or in the headlines of newspapers and magazines the next day. So you might argue that it was a limiting factor on corruption or fraud across the war economy, which, might have very important political effects in terms of public morale and so forth.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Well, we'll carry on.
All right. So in the fourth chapter of this book, I talk about the businesses, the contractors, and their struggles to deal with the government's demands, which they found to be quite difficult, right? And to some extent here, I'm trying to sympathize a little bit with the pro-business story of being hamstrung by bureaucracy or government regulation, even though I think they exaggerated that problem. And so here, maybe I'll take the time to read a short quotation that some of your viewers may be familiar with. And this came from Stimson, the Secretary of War. And he said in 1940 that if you're going to try to go to war or prepare for war in a capitalist country, and this is what he wrote in his diary, actually, in 1940, after the fall of France, you have to let business make money out of the process, or business won't work. So you have to allow business to make money, or business isn't going to work, right? And there are a great many people in Congress who think they can tax business out of all proportion and still have businessmen work diligently and quickly. This is not human nature. So there's actually kind of, I think the second part of the quote, which people don't often hear, is important. He was referring in particular to proposals to create very high taxes. And Stimson, who was kind of a Wall Street lawyer type, right, was suggesting that you couldn't tax business too much or you might remove important incentives, and that maybe the war economy wouldn't work very well. I think this was half true at best, right? Simpson's argument on this regard was kind of half true at best. In fact, in the end, there were incredibly high taxes on the U.S. Home front, and that didn't stop the miracle of war production, if you will, right? So, in fact, Stimson was quite wrong, I think, in some ways about what he was suggesting. And some of your viewers might be interested in that. Anyway, in this chapter, I try to talk about some of the complexities of the U.S. Industrial mobilization for war, which made it kind of frustrating and difficult for contractors to do business with the government. Contractors typically complained about all the red tape. They had to fill out all these forms and paperwork for the government, in part because the government was trying to allocate resources, right? And so you had to report on how much steel you were using or how much steel you needed, or else the government had no idea of where to send the steel, right? So to some extent, this was unavoidable, but business found it to be excessive. Another thing I talk about in this chapter, which I think is really fascinating, and I know your viewers are really experts in military operations, so probably they're not too surprised by this, but the U.S. war economy was very uneven and disruptive, with tons of contract cancellations and cutbacks throughout the war. So, we often think of the war economy as a full employment economy, and everybody's just working round the clock as hard as they can for the whole war. But in fact, at the micro level, or even the local or regional level, that wasn't necessarily the case, because, over time, the armed forces might decide all of a sudden, oh, we need, a lot more destroyer escorts to go with the convoys. We have to ramp that up very quickly, and something else has to suffer. And then later on, oh, okay, now we need tons of landing craft all of a sudden. So we've got to go full speed ahead on landing craft and cut back on some other elements. And similarly, toward the end of the war, oh yeah, we need as many B-29s as we can get, but some of the older bombers we're going to cut back on, for example. So what that meant at the local level for communities and for companies was that there was actually a very, in many cases, a very kind of disruptive, uneven pattern of work. Which I think is really interesting. Even with ammunition, for example, there was a kind of big, there was a big effort at the beginning, and then there was actually some slacking off. And then in the last winter of the war with the Battle of the Bulge, all of a sudden they tried to ramp up ammunition production again. So I think it's kind of fascinating. Some of your viewers might as well, and we might want to talk about that.
I just want to touch on the red tape issue, Mark, because
Yeah,
I think generally we all think that World War II means everything can just get sped through, that people in Britain could just have a meeting with Churchill and bypass all the paperwork and something gets put into production or issued to them the next day. And I think, with Lend-Lease and Roosevelt, we have this idea of, the aircraft being, wheeled up the border of Canada and that somehow paperwork didn't matter. And when you're explaining that, there was a hell of a lot of red tape in the war, I think that kind of blows a preconception apart.
I hope so. And of course the business people like to complain about it, but to some extent, as I said, to allocate resources properly, and some of your viewers know the U.S. had a controlled materials plan and other schemes to allocate critical metals. Because there were priorities, right? If you wanted to get the destroyer escorts done quickly, you might need to send them more resources and fewer, to go elsewhere. Without some knowledge of what was going on, and at the time this was not computerized in large part, right? So it was literally filling out paperwork. Without doing some of that, you couldn't you couldn't be efficient. Now, what the businesses complained about was it was too much. So there, and as you know, this is a constant struggle in modern history, right? But yeah, I think it was important. Let me talk a little bit about price and profit control, because this goes back to the Jack and Heinz story, and also to the Stimson quotation that I talked about. In fact, there were massively high taxes that the US imposed, including an excess profits tax on corporations, where if you made more money in wartime than you were doing in the 1930s, that extra earnings was going to be taxed at a rate of 90% or 95% in many cases. There were also price controls. I think that's well known, and that was kind of widespread across much of the world during World War II. But the US also had this mechanism of statutory renegotiation, which is what I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. In other words, and today some people call these clawbacks, if you made $10 million in profits on your production of gizmos in 1943, there were Army and Navy boards that would look at that and see how that compared to the investment that you had in your company, and see how that compared to the total volume of sales you did. And they might say, hey, we think you deserve only 5 million instead of 10 million, so give us back 5 million. And that was very widespread across the whole war economy. Most companies dealt with this, and they spent many hundreds of hours preparing for these negotiations over this. And what that meant was, and on the slide I also suggest, meanwhile the military and the civilian agencies were repricing contracts. So if you became more efficient as you built more volume, your prices would be expected to go down. And so there was routine repricing by the armed forces. What this meant was that the US had very robust price and profit controls. And I think there's a lot of, kind of cynicism maybe about profiteering that went on the home front, at least in the United States. But what I found is there was this very elaborate effort to cap profits and prices that is pretty remarkable and was pretty effective. And it also helped to keep down inflation during the war. So anyway, that's part of my story, and your viewers may or may not be interested in that, but to me that is part of the interesting story. In effect, what happened was companies didn't make more money in profits in World War II than they made before the war, right? That was by design. That was kind of what they were trying to do with these taxes and renegotiations. And that was true at the macro level across the whole economy. And it was true at the micro level, even with some of the superstar companies that were the most profitable, like DuPont, for example. They actually made a little bit less money during the war than they had been making in the late 30s. And then, of course, after the war, their earnings really took off. So anyway, your viewers may or may not be interested in that kind of business history angle, but
No, definitely, yeah.
I'll talk about that. Should I pause now for a question, or should I go on to my
well, there's one question about that, about the businesses, because as you said, there are some big players there that internationally known. There are smaller companies that are setting up there. So Gary asked the question right at the beginning, and he's saying, being blunt, were any contracts made to certain preferred companies? So was the system fair? Is basically what we're asking. What did some people get more contracts, or because they were better known, or had more backhanders in the washrooms?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thanks to Gary. My answer to that is not much. So I think that the armed forces acquisition officials were, pretty clean, if you will, and they also had a lot of power. They had a lot of power vis-a-vis politicians, right? So you didn't have members of Congress or the White House steering contracts to a great extent, right? Of course, there may be exceptions, and we can, think about that. But right now I'm working on a book about the Cold War and post-Cold War years. And there's some, during that period, you might argue there's actually more of that going on than there is in World War II. At least that's my view. So we, maybe there are exceptions we want to talk about, but that's my answer. That it was a pretty well run and
Okay,
relatively clean operation.
good. And just one more question based on that subject. As Sean Brennan is saying, if companies couldn't make excess profits, did they invest money back into business, which would help with the post-war boom?
Well, they complained a lot about their inability to keep enough profit, which was harming their ability to invest for the post-war period. So they did make some profit, right? So what I was trying to show in the charts is a lot of them made profit at around the same amount, and in some cases even around the same rate that they were before World War II. So they weren't denied, it wasn't a zero profit situation. So they did have some money to invest going to the post-war, but they weren't, what I'm suggesting is, no, they weren't accumulating like massive new sums that put them in a great position to invest for the post-war boom. I'll throw out a name of another historian here, that because there's a new book, I guess a year old or so, by an economic historian called Alex Field. It was published by Yale University Press last year. And Field has an interesting take on the whole war economy subject, which is he thinks it was really terrible for American economic productivity. And he's not confining himself to the profit question, but the chaos of the war and the throwing of resources into the making of wasteful items, weapons, that have no civilian post-war use. He thinks it's actually quite disastrous for American economic productivity. So kind of an interesting story there. He sees the 1930s as being a better decade for productivity than the 1940s. So
Wow. I have to search him out.
Check out Alex Field's book if you get a chance. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, we'll let you get a bit further ahead, and then we'll do some questions later on or at the end.
Yeah. So let me talk about what I think is a kind of fun chapter on seizures. And there I'm not talking about epileptic seizures of humans, but rather seizures, takeovers of businesses in World War II. And I start the chapter with a quotation from Eleanor Roosevelt, and she wrote her husband toward the end of the war saying she was really frustrated that there was a company that made in the textile industry in Gastonia, North Carolina, which is right near my hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina. And in this case, the company's workers had been trying to create a union. And they actually had a government-sponsored representation election, and they had voted for the union. But the company was resisting. And so the company didn't want the union there at all, and was kind of, dragging its heels in negotiating. And so Eleanor Roosevelt, a real political progressive, wrote to her husband saying, why don't you just take over this plant, right? And I start the chapter in this way, and I suggest, well, of course, Eleanor is kind of a real left-winger, might have said this, but surely this was not a viable option for Roosevelt, right? Just kind of seize the company because they were resisting unionization. But in fact, it was a viable option, and it did happen many, many times on the World War II home front. So this is my kind of labor history chapter in the book, and I think it's quite an important element of the World War II story. The government seized multiple companies during the war, and they actually seized 3 of them before Pearl Harbor even. And one of those was North American Aviation's aircraft plant in Southern California. Another one in 1941 was Federal Shipbuilding, a major producer of destroyers. and another was a smaller company called Air Associates. But those 3 seizures occurred before Pearl Harbor, and they're occurring because of labor disputes, right? The government doesn't want strikes at these valuable facilities. And the workers and the managers, and in some cases, multiple groups of workers, are not getting along, and they can't figure out a way to compromise over questions of unionization or union benefits. And the government doesn't want to tolerate a lengthy strike that would delay war production, so they seize these facilities. And in about half of the cases, the seizures were blamed on workers. In other words, workers trying to strike illegally or inappropriately. But in about half of the cases, they were blamed on management, where business was illegally resisting a legitimate and proper effort to unionize or gain union benefits. And there were literally dozens of seizures on the US war home front. And this, Paul, this goes to your earlier point about dissent or lack of consensus or lack of harmony. There was a certain lack of harmony in terms of labor management relations on the US home front. Ostensibly, there was a no strike pledge in which unions were not supposed to strike during the war in return for government assistance and decent deals. But in fact, there were a lot of labor disputes, and in dozens of cases, the government stepped in to seize these companies. And in some cases, the seizures were kind of brief or superficial. So, they would march in a few people in uniform, but then in effect, they would just say, okay, everybody go, stop your striking and go back to work and we'll figure this out, right? But in some cases, they were more substantial and they actually kicked out management, or they, tried to overhaul the unions. And there were kind of serious efforts to run these companies by different management or by members of the armed forces. Some of reviewers might be familiar with the most famous of the seizures, at least in terms of the publicity, which was the seizure of one of the biggest retailer companies in the world, a kind of Amazon.com of the 1940s, or a Walmart of the 1940s, which was Montgomery Ward. Its leader, Sewell Avery, was an anti-New Dealer who didn't believe the government had any right to interfere with his labor relations. And rather than accept a compromise with workers at Montgomery Ward, he chose to resist, and he was actually hauled out in a moment, captured by news photographers of his offices in Chicago. But this episode was, again, what I'm trying to suggest, it was actually just one of many, and it affected many of the biggest industries on the home front, from shipbuilding to aircraft to oil and gas, and so on and so forth. Anyway, a little tidbit of labor history that some of your viewers might be interested in. In the last part of the book, I try to take the reader into the post-war period. And this is an interesting story, in part because of what I said earlier. Remember, the US owns most of the war plant at the end of the war. So what happens to that public-owned war plant? I think this is maybe an underappreciated story of privatization. There's billions of dollars worth of industrial plant is sold off to the private sector in the months and years after the war, and I talk about that a little bit at the end of the book. And of course, some of the war material is simply trash and has to be disposed of in boneyards or recycled. So a lot of the thousands and thousands of aircraft are melted down for their aluminum or recycled in other ways. But some of the war plant is still quite viable, particularly things like the synthetic rubber industry, which the government holds on to into the early 1950s. Those are actually quite important and still productive and valuable plants that end up getting privatized kind of over the long run, and the rubber companies end up buying them. I also, in this last chapter, I gesture towards a long run story of privatization of the US military industrial complex. In the Cold War period, a variety of actors, including business conservatives like Herbert Hoover, but also kind of moderate, technocrats like Robert McNamara, they take steps to try to further privatize or sell off the government's military industrial capacity and the armed forces in-house capacity to design and build weapons. And that's a kind of a long run story it's still not finished today. In fact, the US Armed Forces still owns some of its own industrial plant. But I think it's a kind of an important story, and there is a shift over time that makes today's US defense sector is very different from the one that fought World War II. Far more privatized, right? And actually there's far higher profits being earned today than there was in World War II, and so forth. Just as one little example for viewers who are interested in shipbuilding, for this will give you a sense. For a lot of U.S. history, the U.S. naval shipyards built a significant fraction of our warships in the United States. And that was true. I don't have a Civil War figure here, but that was true in the mid-19th century.
Mhm.
And then it was also true before, during, and after World War II. After the mid-1960s, all of a sudden, the Pentagon said, no more. The U.S. naval shipyards will produce 0 of our new ships. They do still have an important role in the big work of rehabbing ships and repairing. But it's a pretty striking change. And it's a kind of an interesting chapter in this kind of long run story of privatization, which what I'm suggesting is starts to happen after the end of World War II. And again, just to go back to the war stories chapter, this is really a victory for the pro-business conservatives, right, who are lobbying to have the U.S. armed forces reduce their in-house capacities so that more work can go to contractors during this period. And the U.S. just came out of a long war effort, right, in which it was hyper contracted in Iraq and Afghanistan compared to previous conflicts. So I'm going to just say a few words in conclusion, which is what? So in this book, I try to offer the best one-volume history of the U.S. industrial mobilization for World War II that's available. I hope that people might agree with that, or at least they're willing to test it. And what I emphasize, in the book is really the fact that I think public actors in the armed forces, in civilian agencies, have been kind of underestimated in their contributions and their capabilities in the World War II industrial mobilization. What are some maybe 21st century implications that we might want to think about if we think about the record of the big U.S. industrial mobilization for World War II? I'll just leave the viewers with two ideas or 2 examples. One is I actually got some inquiries from the media for a few weeks back in 2020, 2021, when people were worried about COVID and about, how can we produce enough ventilators, or how can we produce enough vaccines, or whatever. And what I said at the time, which I think is still true, is, it is worth thinking about what's the role of the public sector and the private sector in achieving what you want to get done, and to what extent might you want to have some public investment or public coordination in capacity or supply chains. And I'm not actually I'm not the world's greatest expert on Project Warp Speed, but viewers might be interested in comparing that effort to some of the World War II stuff. What I will say is, and I did publish a little piece on this, I think the amount of profiteering that occurred among the vaccine manufacturers in the US, by which I mean Pfizer and Moderna, was absolutely outrageous and unacceptable by World War II standards.
Right. Yeah.
Really, they probably made about 10 times as much profit as they should have done if you think about the standards that the US imposed in World War II. And I think that speaks to a failure of leadership in the US government and in the US business community. And it's really a shameful episode in our history that hasn't gotten enough attention. So I'll stop getting on my hobby horse about that. But I sincerely believe that. And really, our leaders should have thought more about the World War II record before they negotiated those contracts. The other thing I'll say is, I started to engage with just as soon as my book was appearing, was some of the people who are interested in my book and its subjects are the so-called Green New Dealers in the United States. In other words, younger people by and large who are trying to think about ways to mobilize to alleviate climate change. And there are some, I think, some interesting possibilities there in terms of, well, if you want to increase your capacity for solar production or electric vehicle production by a factor of 10 in 3 years, what might that look like? Well, the US and for that matter, other nations, the Soviet Union or Germany or what have you, they actually dealt with comparable problems for World War II to some extent.
Mm.
And so, we might want to look back at the World War II record as we continue to think about ways to grapple with the climate change issue. And so those are two examples of where, maybe past could inform present as we think about 21st century policymaking.
Well, you're speaking to the choir. I mean, we're the converted. We love talking about World War II in terms of how it affects today. Well, tour de force performance, Mark. We've got a few questions that have been building up. Some of them will be quick answers. Some of them will be potential rabbit holes, but I'll power through them now. So Stuart Burbage is saying, which US companies were made by the war? So any names that you kind of think of the ones that kind of made their money and their reputation or their success?
Yeah, that's thank you, Stuart. Perfect question. Well, yeah, I started with one of those companies to some extent, although it's
Yeah.
not that well known today. Jack and Heinz was a war baby that was, nothing before the war and became a significant company during the war. Then they kind of struggled in the Cold War period. There are probably maybe some better examples. Let's see. The one that I think is maybe perhaps the most important in terms of the long run US military industrial complex, you might look to a company like Raytheon. So Raytheon was a manufacturer of tubes, right, that would be used in radios or radar sets. And it was a fairly modest size operation before World War II. Raytheon, along with other companies, became a big player in the radar push, right? The push to make, huge amounts of radar equipment that was so valuable in World War II. And as you know, today, Raytheon's one of the most important US military contractors and has been really ever since World War II. That's one example. The Silicon Valley firms, which also included at that time a lot of tube makers, making high-end, high-performance tubes that could be used in radar sets. A lot of those companies then became the basis for the chip companies, right, in the 50s and 60s, which of course made a lot of their early money supplying the US military before they went into commercialization in the 60s and 70s. So, between, I would say, American high tech, right, these high tech companies like Raytheon and the Silicon Valley firms were actually boosted a lot by World War II.
Okay, thank you. And this one, World War II Analyze is asking, is there evidence the business lesson of World War II was basically never again? Let's make sure that in the future we make a lot of money by portraying this whole regulatory scheme as inefficient.
Yes, if I understand the gist of the question correctly, the business community did want never again in terms of severe caps on profits, prices, and labor management relations, for that matter. So labor unions really grew a lot in World War II with government backing. That was another deep concern of these business leaders. They didn't want those things to repeat. That's a great question, because in some ways they were willing to accept, or they were resigned to accepting some of the regulations during the war, but they really wanted to win the post-war, right? They wanted to come out of the war with less government regulation, less power for labor unions. And I think, yeah, this is a very astute question, and I think it's quite correct. And what I argue in the book is they largely succeeded.
Right, brilliant.
Yeah.
Great response. This one, Peter O'Connell is saying, I could be wrong, but I don't recall the US was importing raw materials at the time. Aside from money and manpower, what were the remaining rate limiting factors, if any? And that's when we talk about Japan. When we talk about Japan, of course, raw materials are half of their downfall, because everything was dependent on oil and fuel and rubber and everything else. So is Peter right that the US never had to import anything in terms of raw materials?
Yeah, great question. Of course, the U.S. is blessed with, a massive continent worth of raw materials, so perhaps more so than others. A couple of examples of places where the U.S. ran into big problems. The biggest one by far was rubber, right? So all the rubber used in all the tires in vehicles and aircraft and so forth was from Southeast Asia. The Japanese took that over by early 42. The US was up a creek, right? And so that's why they had to create from scratch almost an entirely new massive synthetic rubber industry. So that was a terrible, terrible problem that some people thought might cause the Allies to lose the war. And they kind of barely overcame. There were other things that were imported, like specialty, metals and ores from around the world, from Europe, Africa, and South America. Bauxite, the raw material that went into aluminum production, came from the Caribbean region and elsewhere. So it wasn't as if there was, the U.S. had the luxury of continuing to be able to import from the Western Hemisphere, certainly, right, to a large extent. So there were some things like that that were important. Yeah. They also got some good electric power from the Canadians, which had massive hydropower, for example.
Then we've got a few more. So, and then we'll leave it at that. So, Phil Bosworth, what happened to all the tools and jigs that were only used for war production? You talked about the melting down of the aircraft and things like that, but what about all the machinery and the gubbins behind it? Could any of that be recycled?
So I don't, this is I don't know the kind of full answer to this. Some of the stuff that was used for maybe the more late production models, right? Like the B-29, for example, was kept on hand, mothballed. And, the US, some of these machine tools like big forges and presses and other machine tools were actually kept on stockpiles and used, for the Korean War, for example. As for some of the jigs and things like that, I assume a lot of that had to be scrapped, but I'm not 100% sure.
I mean, it's like the whole thing about the fact the US left all their Jeeps and Deuce and a Halfs in Europe. It costs more money to take them back and take them apart than it does just to abandon them. And that's why there are jerry cans in Brazilian jungles and bits of airfield matting all across the Sahara. But anyway, a question that's, I'm going to word it slightly differently from the way Ian asked it, but it's interesting. Ian is saying, was poor company health and safety at work monitored and actions in this respect taken against management? So I'm going to kind of open up to, were there any kind of shortcuts in health and safety, to get the war production quotas up? Did accidents at work increase, for example?
I think they did, and I don't have the figure on the tip of my tongue, but I want to say that more Americans died in industrial accidents than they did in combat into 1942, probably into maybe the end of 1942. So there was a lot of death and injury going on in these factories. I mean, these are steel mills and coal mines and other highly hazardous workplaces during this period. And this is one of the reasons why labor unions are successful and important, is because they are some of the biggest players. We don't have OSHA during this period, but the labor unions are some of the biggest players in trying to improve safety. Just to go back to the example I gave at the beginning, Bill Jack was famous for offering a lot of extra health care for his workers. He was a kind of welfare capitalist, by which I mean he didn't have labor unions and he didn't like them, but he gave a lot of extra benefits in terms of health and food and massages and things like that in his factories in Cleveland. So there were some of these welfare capitalist companies that actually had internal kind of health and safety programs as well.
Okay, this next question, I have to say, I don't fully understand what it means, but that means it's beyond me, but hopefully you understand. So Trent Zelenko is saying, how much did the US Congress merchants of death hearings in the 1930s poison the federal government big business relations in World War II?
Yeah, so if in chapter 1 of my book, which I didn't really talk much about today, I cover this. And in the 1930s, one of the biggest, I talked about the Truman Committee, but one of the other big similar investigations that happened in the 1930s was the Nye Committee investigations into the US, and for that matter, the global arms industry. And part of what they were trying to get at is whether arms firms had, contributed to, World War I, and were continuing to contribute to militarism during this period. And DuPont and other big military contractors were investigated during these hearings. And it was a fairly left progressive investigation, and it concluded, in fact, that more of the U.S. arsenal should be nationalized, so that the Nye Committee tried to get the Navy to build even more of its own warships and the Army to build even more of its own weapons. Business conservatives, including the DuPont family and others, were alienated by the Nye Committee hearings. But that didn't stop DuPont from being one of the big contributors to the war effort. They ran many of the biggest explosives plants, and your viewers may know they ran Hanford's plutonium production facilities for the atomic bomb project. So I wouldn't say that those hearings poisoned or ruined government business relations, but they were part. I mean, let's be honest, it's the Depression and New Deal. They were part of the story of a very antagonistic relationship between many business leaders, many conservative business leaders, and the Roosevelt administration. And what I was trying to suggest earlier is that really continued into the war. And that's one reason why these business leaders were trying to win this PR battle. They really didn't want the story to be the New Dealers won the war. On the contrary, they wanted the story to be capitalism and our great private companies, for-profit companies, won the war.
We'll have to do a show in our myths series, because I remember that the Lucky Strikes going to war thing about that they removed the green packaging so that the green ink could go to Jamaica uniforms. It apparently is a myth, isn't it? So I think the factories going to war ended up working so well, the public believed things that weren't even true. I mean, it's in Britain, it's the Spitfires being made out of old frying pans that spoiler alert, never happened, folks. So in some ways, the government were so good at convincing people that everybody was behind the effort. They did too good a job. But one last question. And it's you kind of half touched on this, talking about COVID response. But Sean Harris is saying, with the export of manufacturing from the United States the last 30 years, would a return to a total war economy be possible today? And I'll just say that someone answered that by saying, yes, if something like Pearl Harbor happened again, it would. But what's your takeaway?
Yeah, and I'm interested in that because I'm trying to work on a book that's looking at more recent years. Great question. I mean, as Sean probably knows, the U.S., I would say over the last, 7 to 10 years, the U.S. has actually moved a little bit toward more onshoring, or at least more U.S. allied onshoring, right? So there's increasing concern about a possible conflict with China and our dependence upon China and global supply chains. And this was reinforced by the COVID crisis, of course. And I would say that it's correct that the US is dependent on these global supply chains in a way that they weren't during World War II. So you couldn't achieve what you did in World War II today. But there is an acknowledgement of that now, I think more than there was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And so there's actually more of an effort to do more strategic onshoring. And that's been true both in the Trump administration and the current Biden administration. And I think folks at the Pentagon are aware of that as well. So that, yes, it's true we can't do it again. But on the other hand, people do have that in mind and they're trying to find ways to make that easier, I guess.
Well, brilliant response. And I think on that note, we will leave it there. I've been amazed at the number of questions that came in. We only got to about half of them, but it just means I have to think of a reason to bring you back again in a future show, Mark.
All
because who'd have thought manufacturing, economics, and production would be so sexy?
Yeah, but, what could be more dull than that subject? Yeah.
No, you've done a fantastic job. So, Mark, it's been great talking. I'm glad your tour with Mag a couple of years ago in Normandy put us two together, because it's been
that was such a pleasure. Say hi to Mag for me.
Will do. So, folks, we're back again tomorrow. Don't forget, tomorrow's show is 2 hours earlier because there's a World War I TV show at this time with Lucy tomorrow. So I'm on 2 hours early with Wendy Goldman talking about the Soviet factories there. So thank you, everybody, for your questions. You know what to do. Some of you already promised to go out and buy the book. So that'll be a few more pennies in Mark's pocket with the royalties. So that's good there. And others, you know where the links are there in the description below. So I will see you all tomorrow. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, viewers. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for your attention. Bye.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody.